scriptures and sacred stories are all built upon a common foundation of celestial metaphor, including the stories in the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments of the Bible. Once we begin to understand this worldwide system, the similarities between star myths from many different cultures and many different parts of the world become more and more difficult to deny. The story of Odysseus in the myths of ancient Greece contains several very clear parallels to the gospel stories in the New Testament, for example. One of the most obvious parallels is the crucial foot-washing scene in the Odyssey, in which the returning king Odysseus is recognized by his faithful nurse, Eurycleia, who loves him and who nursed him when he was an infant. During a scene in which she is washing his feet, Eurycleia recognizes Odysseus when her fingers touch a wound in his thigh. This scene resonates strongly with events in the New Testament gospel texts, supposedly written about events taking place some 700 or 800 years later, such as the foot-washing scenes in which a woman anoints Jesus with precious ointment from an alabaster box, or in which Jesus himself washes his disciples' feet, or in which Thomas recognizes the risen Christ by placing his fingers in the wound in his side. Elsewhere in the Odyssey, there's a scene in which Odysseus is plunged completely into the ocean and is rescued by a goddess who appears in the form of a seabird and who instructs him to take off all his clothes and wear only her sash around his waist. The details of this encounter, close to the beginning of the adventures of Odysseus in the Odyssey, closely resemble the details of the baptism scene at the beginning of the earthly ministry of Jesus in the Gospels, in which Jesus is always depicted wearing just a simple garment about his waist, and in which a divine personage descends on him in the form of a bird, in this case a dove, and some scholars would argue it is the divine feminine aspect of the Godhead who descends as the dove in the baptism scene. There are many other very powerful parallels between the events in the Odyssey and those described in the New Testament Gospels. The reason for these close parallels, according to my analysis, is that these stories, like so many other myths and sacred stories from around the globe, are celestial in nature, depicting the same constellations in different forms and characters having different names and wearing different costumes, but who still retain recognizable features from their celestial counterparts. For example, in the Old Testament story of Balaam and the angel, a prophet named Balaam is riding on a donkey, and his path is blocked by the angel of the Lord. The donkey turns aside, but Balaam strikes the animal to force it to continue. We read that the angel of the Lord stood in a path of the vineyards, a wall being on this side and a wall on that side. And in the next verse we read that the animal thrust herself up against one of these walls to try to avoid the angel, and that Balaam's foot was crushed in the process. This is a very clear reference to the constellation Perseus in the sky, which, as seen in this outline, has a distinctively twisted foot. Perseus can be envisioned as riding on the back of a donkey if we realize that the constellation Perseus is directly above Taurus in the sky, and if we realize that the long horns of Taurus could be and were envisioned as the long ears of an ass or donkey in ancient myth. We see very strong parallels once again to Greek myths in the story of Hephaestus, the Greek god of fire and the forge, who was described as being lame in both feet and who was often described as riding on the back of a donkey. Thus, we can be fairly confident in our identification of Balaam with his crushed feet and the constellation Perseus, and in the identification of the donkey with Taurus in this particular ancient text. The vineyard in the story of Balaam is no doubt the great square of Pegasus, which plays a field or a vineyard or a walled city square in many other star myths from various cultures. The angel who blocks the path of Balaam and the donkey in this story is almost certainly Andromeda, who can be shown to play the role of an angel in other star myths as well. These very strong parallels between the stories of the Old and New Testaments of the Bible are just a few of literally hundreds more which could be offered. Taken together, they show beyond a reasonable doubt that the stories of the Bible are directly based upon celestial metaphor, as are the sacred stories of virtually every other culture on earth. This common celestial foundation actually shows that all of the ancient wisdom imparted to humanity from some unknown ancient source is actually closely related. Unfortunately, this is a realization that has been obscured over the centuries by those who insist that the stories in the Bible represent literal terrestrial history rather than celestial metaphor. My recently published series of books, Star Myths of the World and How to Interpret Them, provides discussion of hundreds of different examples from myths from around the world, showing how they're all based on celestial metaphor, and including hundreds of star charts to help readers learn how to understand the celestial language for themselves. It is my conclusion after years of study that the sacred stories imparted to humanity are a precious inheritance containing ancient wisdom for our benefit, wisdom that is actually crucial to our individual lives. The more we understand the language that the ancient myths are speaking, the more we are able to hear the messages that they are trying to convey.